very much, Dr. McDaniel, for a fascinating look at some technology that I personally didn't know of before I encountered your talk. So we have a few minutes for questions, and we got somebody with a microphone circulating. Yes, sir, front row.
To any and all of the panelists, given your best experience and opinion, do you think 3/8 gravity is going to be a sustainable environment for the human skeletal system? And how important do you think quick testing to find out is to us?
Good question. I don't think we know the answer to that. Some of the studies that were hoped to be done on space station, if a centrifuge were able to have been put in orbit, may well have helped that, helped answer that. We don't know if it's one third, one half, 3/4 of a G that will help us maintain the skeletal structure. Certainly those kinds of questions need to be worked on, and I'm sure that a lot of our researchers are contemplating those very things.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So for Dr. McDaniel, does that mean I don't have to take showers anymore?
I don't.
It's kind of serious.
I mean, it's up to you. Are you French?
Nice. I mean, not nice at all. A serious question actually is, earlier today there was discussion from the Mars panel about contamination, in particular back contamination, and the thought was very low probability that contamination from Mars could have any adverse effects on astronauts and certainly on Earth in general. I wondered if you could comment on that, given the uncertainties you talked about regarding microbial physiology, microbial ecology on human beings, and then also the uncertainties associated with forward contamination of Mars as well.
Well, I think you've hit on an obvious use of this tool. We cannot necessarily control, because let's posit that there are microorganisms that we need to worry about in the back contamination sense. Okay, we have absolutely no idea what those microorganisms will look like. So for us to sit here and to design biocides or antibiotics or anything that would deal with those kinds of unknown situations is a little silly. I personally am a little bit more concerned about back contamination of mutated Earth-derived microorganisms. And I do think we have to worry about that. My friend Chris McKay and I have had several discussions about this. Chris is very keen, if you know him, about being able to control backing out. And backing out is very important. Let us say we determine that there is extant life or something like that. At least one suggestion is you want to back out, and you certainly don't want that forward contamination. Those microorganisms will mutate. They will mutate for sure. They're mutating all the time. They just have an underlying baseline mutation rates, okay? But when you stress them, especially if you put them singly in a situation where they have to look for food, oxygen, water, etc., they will mutate. Can we use things like the protocope molecule and other enzymes to do that? Yes, because we can use them prophylactic. We don't have to distribute them. They're entrained in the coatings. They're entrained in, if we have a spacecraft on the surface of the planet, you're going to have coatings on it, and you might as well put things in there that would prevent that back contamination from taking place. That was my opinion about it.
Thanks. Next question.
How do you propose the international aerospace community might answer this question? It takes a lot of money, a lot of coordination, a lot of time to go to Mars. And there may be some physiological effects like gravity that you can't adequately test for comprehensively beforehand. For instance, or microbial effects or things like that. So let me take the gravity one. You're in 0G for a long time, and you come back to Earth and you have to sustain 4Gs, 6Gs or more. We don't know if the astronauts can survive that, and you can't test for that how do you prepare governments to spend a lot of money on a grand endeavor like this when you don't know if the astronauts can survive that and you can't test for it?
Well, I think when you talk about the return of how many G's the astronaut might experience, they're not standing, for example. They're sitting. The gravity vector actually goes through the chest, what we call the GX axis. And, we can simulate that. We do know how the body behaves in those kinds of hyper-G environments. The ability to monitor the cardiovascular system and make sure that it is within tolerance. I would hate to use the term within specification, because our ability to maintain the cardiovascular system for these long periods of time, might be difficult, but certainly, keeping them within a certain tolerance that we would anticipate they would be able to survive those kinds of returns, I think we can study. And I know we have scientists in the audience that are specialists in cardiovascular systems and have been looking at these kinds of things for a number of years. Maybe they would like to volunteer a comment.
You asked the question had to do with convincing governments to invest money. And I think one of the best viable paths forward with that, with regard to addressing the whole suite of human health risks in space flight, is to very clearly delineate the risks as well as we can, and then to tightly focus research programs against those risks, and tightly couple that in as much as possible to the actual delivery of medical care in space. And I think that's what we're trying to do, certainly in NASA, through the efforts of the Johnson Space Center. That's what we're trying to do collaboratively with our international partners in developing an integrated medical care model on the International Space Station. And hopefully those sorts of logics, as they find their way back in reports to government agencies amongst all the partners and potential partners, will be somewhat compelling when the time comes to actually launch those exploration flights missions.
If I may, Rich?
Yes, sir.
I think General Bolden said very well this morning that there are going to be risks and things that we can't know, and there'll be losses along the way. However, in terms of common sense, it's just hard to believe that as a life form that we are permanently confined to this planet. It just doesn't seem logical.
Richard, can I make,
Better not be.
can I make one comment? And I'll make this comment with permission of Chris, basically from the Explore Mars point of view, the organization that's hosting you. I think one answer to your question is it is the public will that will dictate our level of tolerance of risk, our level of tolerance of disaster, and these kinds of things. I'm not sure that we've done a terribly good job. NASA tries, and it really tries hard. I'm not sure we've done a terribly good job of garnering that goodwill. Explore Mars, as an organization, is dedicated to doing those kinds of things to engender a public grassroots interest in the very same things that we're talking about. You'll hear people talking about the Mars Education Prize and some of the other initiatives that this group is doing. They've just begun, and we're already seeing a lot of success. We're already seeing a lot of public goodwill turn this way, and NASA is a great partner in this, as is ESA and the other organizations as well. So I think we have to work pretty hard on that.
Well said, thanks. Yes, sir. Well, okay, go ahead, sorry.
Hi, Guanglu Zhang from the International Space University. I have two questions. One is medical related, and the other is policy related. First, for the medical specialist, I understand that currently the medical procedures on board the ISS have been purely diagnostic. Correct me if I'm wrong. What are the future plans for more invasive or more emergency response from a medical procedure point of view? And also for the gentleman from Astrium, would you shed some light on the insight, shed some insight on what the European perspective is on the I-STAR proposal, or the plan for using ISS as an analog research testbed? Thank you.
From the standpoint of medical care on orbit, we have a certain suite of therapeutic things that we can do. For example, suturing, intravenous fluids. We do have the capability even now of utilizing rudimentary ventilatory support on orbit. Those are complicated by the fact of, how long can we sustain that type of care, and once we go down that path of launching into that care, how do we get that individual back to the surface of the Earth to a designated medical care facility. So, from the standpoint of the things that we're doing right now, we're looking at diagnostics, and in particular ultrasound techniques, to further evaluate and maybe go beyond some of the typical terrestrial uses of ultrasound. And we are, working with other organizations to develop things like the lightweight trauma module, which has the capability of ventilatory support, oxygen delivery, peripheral oxygen measurements, EKG, that type of thing. To say that we're going to get into, surgical techniques, there have been a lot of activities with regard, for NEMO, for example. The Canadians were looking at a remote robotic surgery capability. That's certainly out there. It's probably a long time away before we're going to be flying such a capability. I might turn to my telemedicine colleague and ask for some commentary in those regards.
Direct robotic operation isn't quite practical as far as how much the astronauts or cosmonauts would be asked to do for an intervention. It comes to a balance. How bad do you need the person who's hurt? Can you afford to lose them and still have the integrity of the team? And if it means you need them pretty badly, there aren't that many of you going to Mars, then people might learn to do all manner of things. The second thing that comes into play is the press conference test. Are we willing to say that astronaut Jones died of appendicitis today because there was no plans for intervention on the way to Mars? If that's acceptable, that's okay. On the other hand, let's not be ridiculous. You can't have someone on life support for the entirety of the mission because they have a terrible brain injury. I think there are reasonable medical decisions and limited interventions that the crew can learn, and I'll bet they do very well.
And I think the Astrium question.
The answer with respect to using ISS as an analog test bed, it's quite, and I'm certainly not speaking for ESA, I'm speaking from Astrium, from my visibility. There has been had been a call for ideas late last year, which really sparked a lot of response in Europe for how to use ISS as a test bed for exploration. And there is a clear understanding that ISS should be used as a technology test bed in this respect. And there was also just very recently an announcement from the European Union, the Commission for Space, that ISS is such an asset and should be used, and the European Union is looking into their own position still for exploration, but certainly ISS should stay the corner piece for any of these type of programs.
you. Maybe one last question.
Doug Brett, Dynamac Corporation. The discussions today on the microbial communities have me curious. Dawned on me that we have a microbial community that has more space-time than any other organism, I would say. Thousands of generations up there by now. Has anybody looked at the genetic changes in one of the more common species that make up that microbial community in all those times?
Dr. Becker has, she heard that. Yes, the answer is yes, they certainly have.
Okay, we're almost back on time. Thank you very much, panelists, for an outstanding panel, and thank you.